When someone feels ill enough to seek the advice of a healer, he naturally looks for a person whom he regards as an authentic source of cure. But we don't all have the same ideas about medical authenticity. The healers who are consulted by members of one society may be altogether different from those who are recognized elsewhere. But broadly speaking, healers fall into two main groups. There are those who exercise a miraculous touch, and there are those who practice an expert skill. In this program, we're going to look at members of the first group. Here in the Royal Mausoleum of Saint-Denis, which is just to the north of Paris, the French monarchs have been interred ever since the 6th century. In this huge stone mortuary, they're laid out in serried ranks which fill the aisles. Well, in most of these tombs, the effigies of the king and queen lie side by side, one by one. But in some of the Renaissance tombs, we find not one image of the monarch, but two. Under the canopy, there are the mortal remains of the king and his queen, and on top, the vivid image of the monarch as if in life. Well, these days we regard an arrangement of this sort as a healthy reminder of human mortality. That even kings must die, that sceptre and crown must tumble down, and in the dust be equal made with the humble scythe and spade. But for the Middle Ages and for the Renaissance, it was much more complicated than that. Twin effigies like this were really the expression of a constitutional theory, which insisted that the monarchy as such was an immortal institution which long outlasted the life of any one of its single mortal officers.
For the king has in him two bodies, namely a body natural and a body politic. His body natural, if it be considered in itself, is a body mortal, subject to all infirmities that come by nature or accident, to the imbecility of infancy or old age, and to the like defects that happen to the natural bodies of other people. But his body politic is a body that cannot be seen or handled, consisting of policy and government, and constituted for the direction of the people and the management of the public weal. And this body is utterly void of infancy and old age and other natural defects and imbecilities which the body natural is subject to.
Well, this constitutional principle helps to explain one of the most interesting and intriguing episodes in the history of medicine. It's the story of the so-called royal touch. For more than 700 years, the kings of both England and of France were regarded by their subjects as, well, miraculous physicians, sacred healers, people whose mere touch was enough to cure physical illness. The origins of this idea, of course, are very obscure. Kings have always been regarded with some sort of sacred awe. But among the pagan tribes of Germany, from whom the French kings took their origin, the chieftains were assumed by their subjects to have some sort of supernatural control over anything which affected the health and prosperity of their people. But with the arrival of Christianity, the power which was inherent in the person of the king and in the person of his royal family was gradually transferred to the institution of monarchy itself. So that although the rightful claimant to the throne was still expected to come from a line of privileged individuals, any supernatural power which he had or might have had was thought to be incomplete until he himself had been ritually anointed with consecrated oil. In the early days, when the supernatural authority of the king was still associated with his mortal person, his healing power was vague and non-specific. It was a panacea, which meant that it could be applied to any illness. However, by the time the ritual of Christian ordination, the act of coronation, had made the monarchy into an institution in its own right, the healing power of the king had undergone a mysterious specialization. From now on, all the sufferers who made their way into the royal presence all seemed to be suffering from the same illness. It was called scrofula. Now, this was a rather unsightly tuberculous inflammation of the glands of the neck. In fact, this illness became so closely associated with the ritual of the royal touch that it was known as the king's evil. It was almost as if the monarch was not only the cure, but the cause of the illness. Now, it's very hard to explain why it should have been scrofula rather than anything else. Perhaps it was a question of dramatic contrast, the squalid poverty of the sufferer on the one hand, and the exalted majesty of the king on the other. As if the king, by stooping from such a great height to exert his magical power, emphasized and dramatized not only the power, but also the magnanimity of the crown. It's impossible, of course, to know whether the kings themselves believed in their own powers or not. Presumably, most of them did. But even if they didn't, there was an obvious advantage to be had from exploiting the royal touch, and almost without exception, they seized upon the ritual as a way of confirming or dramatizing their rightful claim to the throne. In fact, this is probably the reason why it was established in the first place. In England and in France, the ceremony of the royal touch was inaugurated by families who had seized the throne under somewhat shady circumstances. And these usurpers needed some outward sign of their authenticity. In fact, they exploited the royal touch as a seal of approval. By curing his subjects, a man could prove that he had a divine right to rule over them. Henry VII and Henry VIII reintroduced the ceremony in the effort to consolidate the claims of the new Tudor line. And when Mary Tudor succeeded to the throne, she tried to counteract the unpopularity, which was probably the result of her fanatical Catholicism, by making her ritual healing a prominent feature of the royal calendar. The story of the royal touch is intriguing for many reasons, and I suppose one's first impulse is to ask whether it was effective or not. Did it actually work? Well, for obvious reasons, that's almost an unanswerable question. Though, if one means, did the royal touch actually cure tuberculous glands in the neck, then I think one would have to say it's extremely unlikely. But on the other hand, since many of the illnesses which would have been grouped under the heading of scrofula at that time would have got better on their own, I mean things like impetigo and eczema, for example, then it would have been quite easy for them to have attributed the cures to the royal touch. But quite apart from that, I think it would be foolish and short-sighted to overlook the positive effects of faith as such, even on a serious illness like tuberculosis. The clients who shuffled into the royal presence were all powerfully convinced that the king had magical power. But as the 18th century drew to its close, faith in this magical power had begun to subside, and in France it suffered a fatal blow from which the royal touch never recovered once Louis XVI was executed. When Napoleon was crowned emperor, He made a half-hearted attempt to reinstate the ritual by commissioning this picture of himself, apparently exercising the royal touch on a visit to the pest house in Jaffa. In England, the ritual survived the revolutionary death of Charles I and was revived by his son. But the heart had gone out of the ceremony by then, and one of the last people who was known to have been touched by an English monarch was Samuel Johnson, who in later life told the story to a friend.
At the age of 2 years, he was brought up to London by his mother to be touched by Queen Anne for the scrofulous evil, which terribly afflicted his childhood and left such marks as greatly disfigured a countenance naturally harsh and rugged, besides doing irreparable damage to the auricular organs, which never could perform their functions since I knew him. And it was owing to that horrible disorder, too, that one eye was perfectly useless to him. That defect, however, was not observable. The eyes looked both alike. As Mr. Johnson had an astonishing memory, I asked him if he could remember Queen Anne at all. He had, he said, a confused but somehow solemn recollection of a lady in diamonds and a long black hood.
Even where the monarchy survived the upheavals of the 19th century, the sovereign had been officially stripped of this magical aura. And yet, if we look closely at the events which surround a royal visit, there still seems to be a folk memory of the royal touch. The young, the old, and especially the sick are often pushed to the front of the assembled crowd, showing perhaps that even in 20th century Britain, there's a lingering association between illness and the patronage of monarchy. The person who inspired this whole ritual was someone who had no time for the splendors of worldly office. Born in a stable and executed among common criminals, Jesus of Nazareth deliberately turned his back on things like rank and title. He shunned the powerful and shocked the world by associating with publicans and prostitutes. For obvious reasons, Jesus Christ is a very special case. But the fact that his magical power was associated with his own personality rather than with any office which he might have held means that he belongs to another group of miraculous healers. It's a group which includes men like the Old Testament prophet Elijah and a whole host of apostles, saints, and martyrs. Men for whom the German sociologist Max Weber used the word charisma.
To do justice to their mission, the holders of charisma must stand outside the ties of this world, outside routine occupations, as well as outside routine obligations of family life. The charismatic hero does not deduce his authority from codes or statutes, nor from traditional customs, nor from feudal vows of faith. He gains and maintains his authority by proving his strength in life. His divine mission must prove itself in that those who surrender to him fare well. If not, he is obviously not the master sent from the gods.
In the case of Jesus Christ, the master was not simply someone chosen and sent by the gods. He was regarded as the incarnation and embodiment of God. And for those who recognized him, the magical power which had been confirmed and proclaimed by the act of baptism somehow permeated everything with which he came in contact, so that the sufferer had only to reach out as the Savior passed.
And a woman having an issue of blood 12 years, which had spent all her living upon physicians, neither could be healed of any, came behind him and touched the border of his garment, and immediately her issue of blood stanched. And Jesus said, "Who touched me?" When all denied, Peter and they that were with him said, "Master, the multitude throng thee and press thee, and sayest thou, Who touched me?" And Jesus said, "Somebody hath touched me, for I perceive that virtue is gone out of me." And when the woman saw that she was not hid, she came trembling, and falling down before him, she declared unto him before all the people for what cause she had touched him, and how she was healed immediately. And he said unto her, "Daughter, be of good comfort, thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace."
The healing of the hemorrhagic woman is an interesting exception, since most of the Saviour's cures were achieved by him touching the sufferer rather than the other way around. And in every other picture, Christ does nothing more than raise his hand in a gesture of blessing, or at most, he lays his hand on the affected part. Christ's cures, then, are not examples of skill or handicraft, and although his hand plays a prominent part, it doesn't immediately affect the outcome in the way that a massage or a manipulation would. Although charismatic power is associated with one man and tends to die with him, it can be transmitted by apostolic succession to those who shared his charisma by being closely associated with his mission. And biblical pictures record the same hand gestures in the medical acts of the apostles. This line of Christian healing extends for hundreds of years, and by the Middle Ages, when plague was rife, pilgrims often sought the aid of remarkable men such as Saint Roch. His miraculous recovery from illness made him a medical legend, with the power to heal others afflicted in the same way. Well, of course, neither Jesus nor, for that matter, Elijah offered their cures as a routine outpatient service. They used their powers somewhat sparingly, and when they did stoop to heal the sick, it was always as a way of dramatizing their mission and a way of making a point about the miraculous power of faith. On the other hand, it would be a mistake to assume that faith healing was only practiced by saints or by saviors. Now, obviously, that sort of ability is more easily recognized in someone who presents himself as a Messiah. After all, if someone can make out a convincing case that he has a mission to save mankind or change the history of the world, then his followers are quite likely to presume that he has other supernatural gifts as well. All the same, the gift of miraculous healing can just as easily be recognized in someone who claims that and nothing else. When illness is widespread and unrelieved, and when the ordinary man has rather low expectations of orthodox medicine, almost anyone who announces that he has the call to heal may attract a hopeful following. Now, one of the most remarkable instances of this is the case of the 17th century Irish faith healer with the rather odd name of Valentine Greatrakes. He was an ordinary country squire who'd served as an officer in Cromwell's army during the Civil War. Now, until he was in his 30s, there was no sign whatsoever that he was marked out for a miraculous career. But shortly after the restoration of Charles II, he felt an irresistible urge to practice faith healing. Now, he found it very hard to explain this, and he even tried to hide the idea from his wife and his family. But the urge soon became overwhelming. Whether he was in private or in public, sleeping or waking, as he said, he still felt the same impulse, to heal, that is. Now, the fact that he was prompted by this urge leads one to suspect that there was a thinly veiled Republican motive, and that as a loyal Cromwellian, he was anxious to prove that the healing abilities were not confined to the monarchy. Anyway, He soon overcame his shyness and announced his mission to the world at large. And it wasn't long, of course, before he was touching and stroking sufferers from all over Ireland. And not only for the king's evil, but all sorts of other illnesses as well. Well, as you might expect, his reputation soon reached England. And in 1665, the year of the plague, incidentally, he was invited to cross the water and lay his magical hand on a rather more classy client. Anne Finch, Viscountess Conway, was one of the most remarkable women of her age. As a girl, she had taught herself Latin and Greek and theology. But she also mastered astronomy, alchemy, and some of the more abstruse traditions of mystical philosophy. Now, these achievements would have been remarkable in a healthy man, but in a 17th century woman who suffered for nearly 30 years from blinding migraine, well, her achievement is little short of miraculous. She represents, in fact, the first in a long line of invalid bluestockings. People like Robert Browning's wife, Elizabeth Barrett, who unconsciously used their illnesses to manipulate the loyalty and affection of their friends. And there's no doubt that the concern which their symptoms created helped to consolidate the intellectual circle on which they depended. Because at one time or another, Lady Conway had been treated, advised, consoled, and inspired by some of the most sophisticated minds in England. Amongst her friends, she numbered the physician William Harvey, the alchemist physician Francis Mercurius van Helmont, and Newton's Neoplatonist colleague at Cambridge, Henry Moore. Well, her migraines persisted, however. So when news of Greatrake's cures reached England, her husband persuaded the Irish healer to visit the Conways on their family estate. Well, after a successful trial run with the local tenants, Greatrake's was finally allowed to lay his magic hands on the aristocratic invalid herself. But the famous migraines resisted his healing touch, so quite naturally, Greatrake's made his excuses to leave. However, by that time, he had become the center of a national controversy. Some people thought that he was a saint. Others were convinced that he was a charlatan. But some of the more serious observers tried to explain his successes as if they were the expression of something called the ether. Now, this was a mysterious spiritual substance which was halfway between mind and matter, which was thought to be capable of transmitting influences from one end of the universe to the other. Now, oddly enough, the members of the Conway Circle had a special interest in this substance, and they would have regarded Greatrake's as a living proof of its existence. They would have thought, presumably, that he was transmitting his healing influence through this medium. Now, it's very unlikely that Greatrake's himself had any interest in it. Perhaps if he'd cured Lady Conway, and if he'd been drawn into her circle, he might have tried to explain his healing power in terms of the ether. But as it was, his mission simply faded away before it had time to acquire a theoretical justification. However, just a little more than 100 years later, we find a spiritual healer who started his career the other way round. That's to say, someone who began with a purely scientific interest in the existence of a cosmic fluid, and then tried to prove its existence by mounting a healing mission, acquiring a charismatic reputation on the way. In 1790, Mozart paid a backhanded tribute to this healer in his opera Così fan tutte. The name of the healer was Franz Anton Mesmer.
Here is the doctor now, no need to worry. Our friend is here, resting quite a hurry.
Silvati amabilis, filis, puelis. The thing is so much we don't understand it. I will translate for you if you command it. But the vernacular is the spectacular, completely flavorless, not recherché.
Who cares for flavor? Do us a favor, make a suggestion. These frantic gentlemen, having the jest, swallowed poison. What do you say?
This is good, doctor, what do you say? It will necessitate knowing the history. I must investigate, study the mystery. A matter of convenience, a confectionery, ingredients how great the number, many or few.
He goes to Catholic, mixed in a potion, and ways of desperate was burning emotion. But when they taken it, what could we do?
Pray do not worry, there is no hurry, there is no hurry. Pray do not worry, there is no hurry. Pray do not worry, for I will make them as good as new.
Yes, but you see, I tried my best.
The Dr. Mesmer was my predecessor ever in Germany, using his principles and based on magnetics. I will demonstrate not to you.
See them gesticulate, oscillate, palpitate, and their convulsions are really desperate.
You must help me, your needed
See them revive again, almost alive again. This pensive thought is to be true.
That opera was written just before Mozart died. But the composer had known him in his early life, and the magnetic healer had even paid for an outdoor production of one of Mozart's first operas. Mesmer himself had qualified as a doctor. He studied medicine in Vienna, and in 1766 he published a rather peculiar doctoral thesis on the influence of the stars and the planets on human health. In some respects, this was a throwback to traditional astrology. But Mesmer tried to reconcile these occult superstitions with the scientific principles of the Age of Reason. Now, fortunately, or perhaps unfortunately, depending on how you care to look at it, there was a respectable theory which allowed him to do just that. At the end of his Principles of Natural Philosophy, Isaac Newton had invited his readers to consider the possibility that the universe was pervaded by an ether.
And now we might add something concerning a certain most subtle spirit which pervades and lies hid in all gross bodies, by the force and action of which spirit the particles of bodies attract one another at near distances and cohere, if contiguous. And electric bodies operate to greater distances, as well repelling as attracting the neighboring corpuscles. And light is emitted, reflected, refracted, inflected, and heats bodies. And all sensation is excited, and the members of animal bodies move at the command of the will, namely, by the vibrations of this spirit, mutually propagated along the solid filaments of the nerves, from the outward organs of sense to the brain, and from the brain into the muscles.
Now, although this idea was originally part of the occult tradition of European mysticism, the fact that it was now sponsored by a scientific genius like Newton gave it an added respectability. And men like Mesmer seized on the ether as a way of dressing up an otherwise ancient superstition. But Mesmer wasn't the only man to exploit this theory. In fact, by the middle of the 18th century, the cosmic fluid had become part of the common currency of scientific thought. Even Newton himself suggested that it might explain the transmission of nerve impulses inside the body. Now, if, as he suggested, the nerves really are filled with the same fluid that pervades the universe at large, it would seem quite reasonable to assume that the mind could broadcast its energy down these fluid-filled nerves and into the fluid-filled space. Anyway, that's what Mesmer assumed. And after making some preliminary experiments with magnets, he found, or thought that he had found, that he could produce the same effect by passing his own hand to and fro in front of another person. He decided, in fact, that the human frame itself was charged with spiritual energy, and since this magnetism originated in the soul, he called it animal magnetism. Mesmer established a stunningly successful salon in the Place Vendôme in Paris. He carefully stage-managed his seances to produce a susceptible state of mind amongst his fashionable clients. He sat them around a wooden tub filled with iron filings and magnetized bottles of water. Entrancing music, drawn curtains, and the master himself stalking the darkened salon in a long embroidered robe all helped to charge this charismatic atmosphere. Inserted into the tub, his patients or clients obediently vibrated, fell into trances, and sometimes even had to be escorted to specially padded antechambers when convulsions got worse. According to some of the more favorable reports, they were sometimes even cured of their symptoms. Well, Mesmer originally chose the term animal magnetism in the belief that it was essentially a physical process, as we've just seen. But the word hypnosis, which later replaced it, implies nothing of the sort. It simply means sleep. And when the word was first coined in 1843 by an English surgeon called James Braid, he carefully chose it to avoid any magnetic implications. As far as he was concerned, the hypnotic trance was brought on by strong psychological pressure exerted by the operator with the help of the artificial fixation of the gaze. Now, although Braid was the first person to explain this, he was certainly not the first to question the part that was played by Mesmer's cosmic fluid. In 1784, a French royal commission investigated Mesmer's claims, and most of the members of the commission, who included people like Benjamin Franklin and the French chemist Lavoisier, agreed that what happened could all be explained as a result of the patient's imagination. In other words, as long as the patient had reason to expect dramatic results, then his own excited expectation was quite enough to bring them about. There was no need to invoke the agency of a magnetic fluid. Well, by the end of the 18th century, the medical power of the imagination was widely discussed. And in 1800, it was invoked to explain yet another medical craze. Now, some years earlier, an American called Benjamin Perkin had introduced a new treatment involving the use of metal tongs, which he called tractors. Now, he claimed that the magnetic field created by these tongs would draw out the evil in a limb, leaving the patient mobile and painless. Well, a West Country physician called John Haygarth was convinced that this was yet another example of the imagination at work. And to prove his point, he made a pair of wooden tongs, painted them with black lead to give them a metallic sheen. And as he predicted, the credulous patient was usually relieved of his symptoms. But like Mesmer, he also appreciated the influence of the physician's demeanor. And in his account, he emphasizes the vital importance of keeping a straight face during the experiment. And he even went to the lengths of brandishing a stopwatch in order to show the patient that serious action was afoot. It may be that this is one of the reasons why acupuncture has received a somewhat more favorable press than it deserves. In the last 20 years, this Oriental import has aroused almost as much interest as Perkin's tractors or Mesmer's tubs. And patients who undergo acupuncture often report experiences which are almost identical to the transports reported from Mesmer's salons.
When you first have the needles put in, you don't feel anything, and after a few moments, you begin to seem to be rising from the couch. Your whole body just raises up, so that you have a kind of cushion of air all round you. And then gradually, your body sinks, and it seems to sink into like a feather bed. And you stay in that sort of cushion of feathery substance, like a cloud, if you like, until the needles are taken out. My body began to shiver a little, as though I was cold, but I didn't feel cold. And then all of my whole body was shaking. My limbs were shaking as well as my trunk.
As with Mesmer and Perkin, it's hard to resist the impression that the paraphernalia and the remote, exotic origins of the practitioner play an important part in shaping the patient's expectations. As an incurable skeptic, however, my own expectations could hardly be lower. And Dr. Chen's efforts to anesthetize my leg with acupuncture were not altogether impressive. Now, would it be possible, using these needles, to anesthetize areas of skin in my leg, say?
Yes, we can try this, because acupuncture for anesthesia is a quite different approach.
So you're going to put the needles in first of all, are you?
Yeah, first needle in, then we'll clip the two points
Electrodes.
on, and feel that?
Yeah, slightly.
Not too strong.
No? But the area of anesthesia that you expect, is it simply the area between the two needles?
No. Sometimes you can put the needle on the starting or end point and produce the effect right up to the middle trunk.
Oh, so it can go backwards?
Yes, on the chest surgery or somewhere near there, heart, open heart, you can have a needle in the arm or the legs. So avoid the area contaminating or too close to the surgeon's knife. I'm going to clip this on onto the needle body and secure the switch on. Give certain vibration and sensations. Can you feel anything?
All right. I feel a slight throbbing down in the ankle.
Uh-huh.
And I'm beginning to feel a throbbing slightly in the skin of my shin.
Yes. Now, can you feel?
I can tell the difference between
Yes.
a sharp point and the tip of your finger.
But we just only try because it's very low.
Yes,
If for anesthetic, it's much, much higher.
Yes, well, try it higher. If I jump off the couch, you'll know that it's too high.
All right.
That's the sign. That's the most reliable sign, is
I
by
don't
jumping
want
up.
to jump.
Yes, no, that's okay. It's certainly not uncomfortable.
No.
I mean, I wouldn't like to go through life with it, but
No. But if you find it helps you through various surgical means, and this may help you overcome the drug problems or side effect of it.
I see.
It takes quite a long time, and usually it should be much, much more stronger.
Mm. Well, you can step it up. I mean, I can slowly. I mean, yeah, it's not unpleasant. I mean, it's not vilely unpleasant. But again, I wouldn't want to spend my life in this condition. I think.
No.
No, it's all right. I can even take a little bit more if you want to step it up.
Quite tight, is it? How you feel?
Yes, I feel the
quite
pulse is.
comfortable?
Yes,
More
I feel.
deeper
Yes, it seems to go deeper into the
tissue.
Yes. I feel as if some layer of superficial muscle was being twitched. Main thing that makes me happy is knowing that I won't be having it for life. Yes.
Right, I want to see how you feel at the moment, okay?
Right.
To just see how the sensation are those still very strong.
No, but it's still I can feel it definitely.
Yes.
But if the current was stepped up and it was longer, would it anesthetize that area?
Yes, I think it will be. But you will feel certain unpleasant feelings.
I'm feeling.
As a by comparison.
But if you were normally going to do this, I mean, in fact, you don't do surgery under this sort of anesthesia. But if this was going to be done in an operating theatre, say in China, it would be prepared with much more drastic current.
Yes, will be much higher output, and the patient will be educated or told how they're going to feel, how they expect, and how they're going to go through the procedures.
That's a very important part of it.
Yes. You can't just take a road traffic accident case, go onto the table and do this, because that won't work. You need a cooperation from the patients.
So the patient's expectation is an important part of what happens.
I think so, yes. The patient needs to know how they can feel, how they benefit from it, and so on.
So, even by the practitioner's own admission, the patient's faith plays a vital part. Even so, some astounding cures have been claimed, and in China, massive surgery has apparently been painlessly performed under acupuncture. But even if these claims could be proved, it wouldn't mean that we would have to accept the physiological explanation which is offered by the acupuncturists. The walls of the consulting room are covered with mysterious charts which propose the existence of so-called meridians, along which some sort of biological energy is supposed to flow. Overtones here of Mesmer's mysterious fluid, surely. The point is that no one has proved the existence of these lines. They only exist because the practitioner has drawn them in order to link up acupuncture points. In this treatment, although something apparently similar is going on, a different sort of theory altogether is at work.
Good. Just try to relax.
These two American doctors are introducing a needle into the patient's spine, expecting to produce a loss of sensation at a site which is quite remote from the point where the needle was introduced.
How do you feel, Vicky? Okay, now, Vicky, one thing you might feel now is an electric shock type of feeling shooting down into your leg. You'll just feel it for a second and try not to move, okay? Feel that?
How about you straighten out your legs? Okay, I want you to roll over so you're facing up that way. Okay?
Which way?
Put it on the back.
On your back. Just roll over. You might also get the sensation that your leg is starting to feel a little heavy. What we're going to do is we're going to check you out with a little needle.
See the needle?
Whether it's
Feel the needle here?
Feel
Okay,
sharp?
that's sharp. Does this feel the same?
No, I can barely feel it.
Barely feel it. Let's try it again. This is sharp? Does this feel the same?
Just like a little
A little less?
pressure, just like
Okay. Feel sharpness here? Let me know when it feels sharp.
After about 40 minutes, though, the anesthetic which they had introduced into Vicky Ann Burke's spine through the needle has quite clearly produced a loss of feeling in her legs. As with the acupuncturists, these American anesthetists are guided by their belief in some underlying structure. In their case, however, the structure can actually be seen. The nerves, after all, can be exposed, unlike the meridians. And far from being the seat of a mysterious source of energy, nervous activity can be recorded and visibly displayed. Even if acupuncture is shown to be effective, the theory on which it is based is much more like medieval magic than modern science. It proposes obscure and sympathetic links which are based on mere resemblance. Now, although we can sidestep, or at least make allowances for the effects of the imagination, we're still no nearer to understanding exactly how it works. Now, I'm fairly sure that the explanation will eventually turn out to be a physiological one. Meanwhile, the modern physician must modestly accept the fact that many of his cures act rather like Perkins tractors and Mesmer's tubs and the Royal Touch, and that many of his pills, potions, and even operations work for no better reason than the fact that the patient and the doctor expect them to.